thank you for coming to this, which is the second of our CJD Support Network virtual family support meeting sessions, which is a bit of a mouthful. I'm Beth, and I'm a member of the Support Network Committee, and I'll be hosting the session today. The topic of today's session, as people should know, is talking about grief and loss, and it'll take the form of a presentation and discussion around 4 themes. This will be led by our guests, Dr. Kirsten Moore and Jill Walton, with insights from their wealth of clinical and research experience. And so I'll be starting off each topic by asking a question to Jill and or Kirsten, and then we'll be kind of opening it out to discussion for questions and comments. And at these points, people should be able to unmute themselves. That should be how it's set up, but I'll be kind of clicking through and checking to see if anybody's waving because they want to contribute, and unmute you if you have trouble doing that yourself. Just to let you know, we are recording the session, including the discussion, so please be mindful of that. If anyone has a question or comment but doesn't want to speak on the recording, which we completely understand, we've got a couple of other options. So I am monitoring the chat, which if you kind of put your cursor or click on around the bottom of your screen, there should be an option to contribute to the chat. That'll come to me privately if you put anything in there, so please feel free to make any comments or questions in there, and I'll feed them back anonymously. We're also going to be switching the recording off for 5 minutes or so towards the end for any final comments or questions if people don't want to speak on the recording. So I should have changed the slide. Just to take a moment to acknowledge also that while obviously we hope that this is a really helpful session for people, we understand that it might bring up difficult issues and emotions. So with that in mind, we just encourage people to kind of, take care of themselves really. If you need to take a break from the session at any point, of course, that's absolutely fine to do so. We will be giving information towards the end of the session about where to get further support, and we'll also make sure to post this information on our Facebook page as well. So before we start the discussion, we thought it would be good, and we're going to be watching a short video actually, but we thought it'd be good just to kind of invite members of the committee and people, kind of professionals who are on the call to introduce themselves, as well as our speakers. We won't ask everybody to introduce themselves at this point because people might not want to speak on the recording during the session. But if you do contribute to any of the discussions, we just ask that you kind of introduce yourselves then. Okay, so Jill, do you want to start? I'll invite people to introduce based on the order that you're in on my screen, if that's okay.
Sure, thank you. So hello everybody, nice to see you. I'm Jill. Very briefly, I'm from the north of England. I was born in Burnley and now live in Hertfordshire. I'm a nurse by training and profession, and I haven't lived with anybody with a dementia diagnosis, but I have worked in the dementia setting for the past 30 years. So thank you for inviting me to join you today.
Kirsten?
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm Kirsten. I'm actually in Australia at the moment. I am Australian, as you can probably tell from my accent, but I've been working at UCL for the last 6.5 years, and I've just moved across. So I'm sort of getting, this is partly why we've got a sort of an early morning slot today, so that because it's 8 o'clock at night here, so it's I'm in a bit of a different time zone. But welcome everyone.
Richard?
Yeah, hi. I'm a neurologist who therefore professionally involved with this disease, and I'm current chair of the CJD support network. I'm an immigrant into Scotland, well established now, but I too was born in Yorkshire.
Oh, Richard, I was born in Lancashire.
I know. Sorry, that was a sort of joke. I didn't stay in Yorkshire long. I moved to Lancashire pretty quickly, about the age of, I don't know, 6 months.
Good move.
Anita, do you want to?
Oh, hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Anita. I am a retired nurse, children's nurse, and our son died of CJD, iatrogenic, and I have been with this network since 1995, 96, and I'm still here.
Annette? Oh, sorry, Annette, you're muted. I'll just unmute you. That's my fault.
Hi, I'm Annette. I'm on the CJD committee. I lost my husband in 2017 to sporadic CJD.
Thank you, Annette. Margaret, do you want to introduce yourself? Sorry.
Hi, I'm Margaret Leach. I'm the National CJD Care Coordinator and I'm Senior Nurse, and I've been involved with CJD, believe it or not, since 2000, so I think I'm built in with the bricks as well.
Thank you, Margaret. Kate?
Yeah, hi, I'm Kate. I've been involved with the committee since 2012 when I lost my auntie to CJD. And I'm from Liverpool, but I work at the moment in London as a doctor.
Thank you. And Simon, are you there to, I don't know.
Yeah, hi.
Oh yeah, sorry, Simon.
Hi, I'm a, hi, Simon Mead. I'm a neurologist and I specialise in diagnosis and care of patients with CJD. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think that's everybody. Everyone, the order has now changed of people's videos. So I think that's everybody on the committee. Sorry if it isn't. As I say, anybody else, if you would, you know, if you're contributing, please do introduce yourselves. So I'm going to start by playing a video now, and then Jill and Kirsten will introduce themselves in a little bit more detail and talk about their background. Hopefully everybody can hear it.
Supporting someone living with dementia can bring people closer together and have positive aspects. But caring for someone can also be incredibly challenging. Here is someone talking about their experience caring for someone with dementia.
Difficult, you think it's the end of the world sort of thing, you know, and trying to cope with it then, it's really hard. It's really, really hard.
Family and friends can experience many different losses while supporting someone with dementia. Many people find that it impacts all parts of their life, their work, hobbies, holidays and social life.
Work-wise, I took a year off work just from exhaustion, and I lost a year's salary, and pensions, those kind of things.
And the loss of friends, because I think they just assume that all weekend I'm with her, so they don't hear from any of them. And that's, I think, also when you feel sometimes lonely.
People describe how changes in the person with dementia can radically change the nature of their relationship.
However much you tell yourself it's not her fault because it's a disease and she can't help it, the fact that your mum doesn't care about you anymore because she doesn't remember you is unfathomable, really.
There isn't really conversation about anything, actually. If I really look at it, he was the only person I would talk to about everything, and he was always on my side, no matter what, and that's completely gone now, and I'm the carer.
How we feel when we experience loss is often referred to as grief, although some people prefer not to use this term. However, recognizing feelings as grief can help some people understand and process those emotions. You may experience grief while the person you are caring for is still alive, which can also lead to feelings of guilt.
It was very challenging because of just the newness of it and the difficulty of managing it. I suppose you're grieving for in effect, the person you've lost and who this new person is.
As a psychologist, when I talk to family carers of people with dementia, they often talk about grief and loss. Often just recognising that you are grieving can help to process and deal with these difficult emotions. It's important that I recognise when someone is grieving and can help them to see that this is a common reaction. It helps to normalise it.
While dementia is a progressive, life-shortening condition, people can have good and bad days, which can make dealing with loss and grief unpredictable.
When I started to feel like I'd lost my dad, and talking through that, my dad has gone, but he's still here. And then occasionally you get a glimpse of the man he was. It is grief, because you're grieving for something that was, but also the here and now and what could be in the future.
Amongst the losses, carers can also see positives and have times of acceptance, love and joy.
He has been a very good husband and father, and for all my frustrations, it would only be me who's needed to look after him, really. You know, the fact that I can do it is a good thing. That's the least I can do for being such a good man.
Someone who is struggling with grief and loss may find it helpful to talk to someone. Finding the right person is not always easy, though.
I think it's the talking and discussing, whether it's with an agency, whether it's with a group, whether it's with somebody in your family. It really doesn't matter, but you must have an outlet. If you hold it all in and bottle it, then it will affect you.
Not everyone wants to talk about grief, and there are other things they may find helpful.
Okay, over to you, Kirsten.
Thanks, Beth. So the work that I've been doing is focusing on the grief that family carers experience while caring for someone with dementia. So I have a background in psychology and sociology, and I've been doing research. I worked at the National Ageing Research Institute in Australia, and my PhD also looked at family carers looking after someone with behavioural and psychological symptoms of dementia. Although whether we call it that is now sort of a bit controversial. But when I moved to the UK, I started working at the Marie Curie Palliative Care Research Department, and there's a much greater focus on the palliative care in dementia. So I worked in care homes, setting up a program on compassion and integrating palliative care into care homes, and then I did a fellowship for the Alzheimer's Society. So we interviewed 150 family carers and talked to them about the grief that they were experiencing while they were caring for someone with dementia. Now, obviously this work's coming from people with dementia of all ages, and a lot of our participants were caring for someone with in older age groups, or not with a rare dementia, but about 15% of our sample were people caring for someone with a rare dementia or a young onset dementia. So the animation that you've just seen was actually from a lot of the interviews that we did, that what we found is that a lot of family carers we spoke to felt that they were definitely going through a grief process while they were caring, because they felt changes happening, but that not necessarily other people recognised that grief. So that animation was developed with support from with the help with carers and healthcare professionals to try and raise awareness of that carers can be going through a process of grief, and to say that that's okay, and that people do grieve before death. So I think that's all I want to say at this point.
And so obviously, yeah, thank you very much, Jill. And as I said, I'm a nurse, and left Lancashire in 1988 to train as a nurse at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington, with the intention of returning to Lancashire, I have to say, but sort of 30 plus years later, here I am still in Hertfordshire. So I clearly didn't return. I joined the Dementia Research Centre in 1993 and worked in the clinics actually there as one of my roles. And what we saw increasingly in those clinics was people being diagnosed with rare dementias, but with really no bespoke support to follow up their diagnosis thereafter. So we had what was then called the Alzheimer's Disease Society, which was providing support on lots of levels for people with Alzheimer's disease, but there was no real bespoke support for people who had a diagnosis of a dementia that wasn't Alzheimer's disease. And so along with colleagues in the early 1990s, I was involved in co-founding the Frontotemporal Dementia Support Group, as it was then, and thereafter subsequently facilitated 4 other support groups for people with different kinds of rare dementia, which culminated in a merger in 2016 of all those support groups into what is now called Rare Dementia Support. So Rare Dementia Support has over 2,000 members, I think now, and they're all people with dementia diagnoses that are not typical Alzheimer's disease. And I have to say that over those past 30 years, I have had the most amazing privilege, really, of walking alongside people with their diagnosis, or with carers of people with a diagnosis of rare dementia. And that really has been the motivation and the incentive for the work that I've been so privileged to be part of on and off over the last 30 years. And most recently, the work with Kirsten in developing this grief and loss programme, which we will talk a bit about later in our time together this morning. And so I'm currently an advisor at Rare Dementia Support. That's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Jill. So this is going to be the kind of first theme that we're going to look at, which is kind of what is grief. So Kirsten and Jill, what is grief and how might dementia impact on how people grieve?
So I'm going to start off and then hand over to Jill. I'm just going to provide some sort of general definitions that are often used in the sort of literature around grief and after death. And it's usually described as an emotional reaction to the loss of a loved one through death. And it's considered a normal or a natural reaction, and it's something that we all experience at some point in our lives or many times in our lives. And it influences in lots of different ways through our emotions, our thoughts, our behaviours, and also through our physical health. We can sometimes be quite surprised at it sort of how it manifests when we might think we're dealing with it quite well. But I guess, you know, it's very difficult to define because it's very individual. It varies so much individual from individual, but there are sort of cultural and religious differences that sort of govern how what we consider as the right way to grieve or the normal way to grieve, and this can often impact how we see our grief process, because we might sort of have a perception that this is the way we should grieve in our culture, our society, or our based on our religious beliefs. But it's quite interesting that despite the sort of religious and cultural aspects of grief, that it is something that is universally experienced regardless of culture and religion, and even is experienced in other animals as well. We can see signs of grief. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not there's another more disordered form of grief, so when you don't have a normal grief reaction, and there's lots of debate about what this should be called. I think at the moment sort of a prolonged grief disorder or a complicated grief disorder has been used, and this is expected to impact on a much smaller number of people who are grieving. So it implies the need for professional support to sort of recover and to get through a grief process. So it's defined in terms of how debilitating it is. So it really impacts on all aspects of your life, but also in terms of how long it goes on for. So it might, most people might have a period after the loss of someone, they might take some time off work, but not being able to get back to work after months or even years perhaps, then that might be considered that person's not being able to resume back into their normal routines and regain certain new relationships or restore their relationships with other people. So there's actually not a great deal of research in carers of people with dementia, but this very small study that has been done suggests that it might be as high as 20%, which is probably higher than what's been shown in the general population for grief after death. Just move to the next slide. And when we look at the bereavement sort of standards in the UK, the NICE quality standards, they're based on research that's been done in cancer services. So they describe a three-tier approach or a sort of pyramid approach, where sort of most people in the sort of bottom of that pyramid, over half of people who have experienced a bereavement would cope without any need for any external professional or formal support. So they would just, through the support from their friends and family, they would be able to manage and move on through that grief. But even for those people, services should at least provide information on how they could access support if they're needing support. The next tier is kind of the sort of around a third of people might sort of want a bit more support through perhaps not professional avenues, but through support groups, volunteer befriending services, things like Cruise Bereavement offers sort of volunteers that might talk to you about your grief experience. And then a very small number at that top of the pyramid who might having that sort of more difficulty dealing with their grief processes that might need sort of a mental health, psychology, counselling, specialist type support. And I'll come back to this later on, because I guess the point here is that while it's been established in cancer services, we don't really know if this works or this model is right for family carers of people with dementia, not only after death, but also as I was talking about, the sort of before death as well. Do you want to move the... So as I've already touched on, and as that animation showed that we developed, that actual as the dementia progresses, people feel like there's fundamental changes in the nature of their relationship with the person with dementia. And often people talk about anticipatory grief. And again, this comes out of the cancer literature, that people with a cancer diagnosis that has a bad prognosis, that people tend to think, how will I feel when that person dies? And so they begin to sort of explore and anticipate the grief that's going to happen. But I think what's different, what people find in dementia is that they're actually experiencing losses over time as the relationship, as a person may no longer recognise them. Children that might be caring for a parent might feel like there's a role reversal, that they now become more like a parent figure or looking after a parent. So that changes quite a lot. And research has quite a wide group of people that they suggest between 47 to 71% of carers experience grief while caring. And a couple of other terms I've put here, I know that they sound like a bit sort of jargonistic terms, but I think they're quite important in that the disenfranchised grief is when someone else or people don't recognise a relationship or recognise that a loss has occurred. So if people don't recognise that because there's no death has occurred, they may not feel like someone has experienced a loss, and therefore they may not realise that they're grieving and that they need support through that grief. And I think that can have an impact in carers of people while they're caring for someone with dementia. Also, I think relevant is this ambiguous grief. Again, while a dementia might progress, the fluctuations or changes in cognitive impairment can be quite confusing. So people might feel like they've lost things, and then it might feel like on another day that person might seem a bit better, and so they might have sort of tried to accept and understand that loss, and then it's come back again. So not knowing sort of the goalposts are always sort of changing. Yeah, I'll hand over to Jill.
Thank you. I think it's really helpful to have those definitions and backgrounds. And I know you kind of said sometimes it sounds a bit jargonistic, but actually I think it's really helpful to have those terms expressed and explained. And I think just kind of taking that forward now, it will be quite helpful for us to just have a few moments to think about the ways in which grief might be affecting us right here and now in our current journeys with dementia and CJD specifically, obviously. And I just thought I'd begin by pulling our attention to this image, which I hope kind of captures something of the essence of kind of what loss does, or the changes that a loss can bring about. And that is to sort of say that when a loss occurs, something changes in the way we view the world. Often something changes about the way we perceive ourselves as we continue in the world. So the world carries on, but never in quite the same way as it did before that loss occurred. And so all the pieces of that broken window kind of go back together, but never in quite the same way as they did before the event that caused your loss and subsequent grief occurred. So that's kind of the purpose of the picture, to convey the essence of loss in some kind of pictorial sort of way. But also I thought it would be good to just bring a summary of Kirsten's definitions onto this slide, and that is in this definition that I've put up alongside the picture. And so if we were to summarize grief as strong feelings of sadness or distress in response to a significant loss, I think we can pull out two kind of sides of that definition. So we've got the feelings that are in response to the losses. And I thought it might just be helpful now to spend a few moments just thinking through what some of those significant losses are at this point in time for you as a result of your journey with CJD. So just by way of one-liners or even one words, do you want to just contribute one or two of the significant losses that you would currently sort of be able to identify as real for you as a result of CJD in your worlds?
If anybody, as I said before, wants to kind of contribute anonymously, you can use the chat function. And you should be able to unmute yourself if you are muted.
Are there any sort of losses that people particularly want to identify and sort of contribute before we look at the next slide?
Someone in the chat has said having someone to do things like take the bin out.
Yeah. And I can see a lady with her hand up here as well.
Oh yeah, okay. Sorry, I keep
there's
losing my
practical
mouse.
things. There's practical sort of things that you just take for granted, suddenly having to sort of figure it out, and it's just become sort of stressful and can become overwhelming, just something quite straightforward.
Yeah. Meg, Mum?
Somebody to talk to, but also somebody to not talk to, if you know what I mean, if you don't want to talk, but you want somebody there.
Yes, absolutely right. And I think there's I think it's Judi Dench, but I'm not sure on that, so don't quote me, but I think she says what I miss is someone to do nothing with.
Yeah, that's it.
It's the kind of doing the mundane stuff of life as much as the big stuff, isn't it? Yeah, it's a really good point.
And linked to that, someone in the chat has said having company and a sounding board.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, so someone said the loss of my go-to person who I went to for advice and guidance, and I think that's kind of something that's echoed in the LPAS video as well that we watched, isn't it?
Yeah. I know the next slide, Beth, the next slide obviously was prepared in advance, and given time, endless time, we could spend the whole morning, probably the whole day, sharing and talking about significant losses that have impacted us as a result of CJD and all that that's meant to us. But obviously, in view of the time restrictions that we have, thank you for the contributions that you have made. And these obviously I had pre-prepared ahead of today, but I think capture the few that you were able to have time to contribute and list others. It's not an exhaustive list by any means, but I don't suppose there's anything on there that people would particularly disagree with. Just a few themes to kind of pull from that list very, very briefly. Obviously, you know, kind of our losses, each loss is significant in its own right, and is unique to each one of us that experiences it. But within those sort of losses, there are sort of themes that are common, despite the very unique aspects that are personal to everybody who has that loss. So there'll be losses within relationships, and the way in which our relationships work, not just our relationships with the person who has the diagnosis, but the impact upon the relationships all around us, the relationship that we can have with our friends and with our children, with our siblings, with our parents, a massive sort of wide-ranging impact on relationship. Those losses will impact on our activities, on the kind of things we do in our spare time, in our hobby time, in our holiday time. those losses may well impact upon the way we live, our living arrangements. So our front room, for example, might be converted into a bedroom, or our downstairs bathroom becomes a walk-in sort of shower room. There'll be significant changes to our own living arrangements. And obviously, as well, if people have to have carers coming into the house, then our own home might feel quite significantly different as a result of that. And ultimately, if people move into nursing care or residential care, again, the impact on our living arrangements is one of the themes where losses are very evident. Financial security is another area where losses can be very relevant. And also, ultimately, of course, when a person dies, we lose that person physically as well. So the loss of somebody in terms of their presence with us here and now. So lots of losses, some current common themes. And as I said, that list we could spend all day really adding to. But just holding on to those losses, I want to just look at the next slide and spend a few moments now thinking about how those losses make us feel. So again, by way of a one-liner or a word, whatever you feel comfortable with, what emotions do you experience in response to some of those losses that we've talked about? Or what physical feelings even might you say you are experiencing as a result of some of those losses? So again, just by the chat box or via a sort of hand wave or a shout out, is there anything you'd like to contribute really at this point? It'd be interesting to hear from you.
So contributions so far in the chat box, we've got vulnerable and numb.
Yeah, I think that's and that's quite a that's very honest, a very honest contribution, and we can't underestimate the effect of feeling vulnerable. It's huge. Thank you.
Yeah, somebody said, so someone said kind of losing the anchor in the family, and someone else said despair and kind of a sick feeling in the stomach.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And that sick feeling in your stomach, thank you for contributing that, because I think that really draws attention to the fact that our feelings are very physical. They're not all emotional. Some of the responses to grief are very, very physical indeed. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah. So hi, I'm Andrew, and I lost my my partner, my husband, just over 2 years ago through iatrogenic CJD. So I think for me, it's 2 years on, and along that journey, thus far, a focus on what loss has meant in terms of meaning in my life, and more to the point, the lack of meaning as it was before.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I just say I agree with that? That really resonates for me.
Yeah. And that's lack of meaning in terms of your purpose and your identity. Would you agree? Is that?
Okay, yeah, that's not yeah, completely. I think every part, I mean, without wishing to sound over dramatic, you know, completely every part of one's life, certainly pre-death, being iatrogenic human growth hormone, as is generally the case in such cases, it wasn't a swift disease duration. There you go. I haven't said that for a long time. So there was that period where meaning was fundamentally changed. Mm-hmm. But post-death, I think it's probably correct to say, in terms of bereavement, in the bereavement sense, or the bereavement world, that meaning had lost. I sometimes liken it to the loss of trust. You can lose, you know, with someone that does something that to let you down, as it were, in the sense that, you know, trust can go just like that, but it can take a long time to build or to rebuild. Completely separately, completely differently. Meaning, though, I think can just go from one's life through loss. But I recognize will, and I'm being positive here, can and will take a long time to reform, rebuild. I'm not sure if that's the right word. I hope that helps from my perspective anyhow.
Andrew, thank you. It really does indeed. And I think, yeah, you make the point about those, I think there's a sort of model of thinking which talks about the assumptions we hold about the world. And quite often those assumptions are broken when you're faced suddenly with a diagnosis you weren't expecting. And the impact of those broken assumptions about a world you expected to sort of roll on in a way that it didn't is exactly, I think, what you're giving testimony to. And so thank you again, everybody, for your contributions there. I appreciate it. It's not easy across a screen for sure. And thank you. And the next slide, I think, again, touches on some of those. It certainly pulls in the fact that we have emotional as well as physical feelings as a result of the losses that we experience. Bearing in mind the comments that you've made and the list on the slide, I just wonder if we were to try and give a description to the type of feelings that those are. They are overwhelmingly disempowering, aren't they? They're overwhelmingly powerful, they're overwhelmingly painful feelings, and painful feelings can be quite disempowering. And so I think the point of just taking a bit of time out to really kind of sit back and identify some of the impact of grief on our lives in terms of its reality is just to allow us to recognize the impact of those feelings and have permission to accept the impact of these on our lives. And Andrew, if I can just refer back again to your point, I think you said, I'm sorry if this sounds dramatic, and without wanting to sort of embarrass you in any way, there's no need to be sorry that you sound dramatic, because if you look at this list of feelings, it's a dramatic list of feelings to be managing. So it's no wonder that it feels as it does. The next slide, I think, just confirms the points that I was trying to make there in that sort of list. And the first sort of point I wanted to just pull out really is to say that it is entirely possible to be feeling grief as a result of the losses you're experiencing before the death of the person you care for. And that grief continues long after, and actually some people would argue never goes away. It becomes a different part of your life, and a part of your life that you manage differently. But quite often I think we don't recognise that a grieving process has begun long before the point of death. And sadly, as a result of that, we are not supported adequately in our grieving along our dementia journey. And so the other thing is really just to reaffirm that whatever you're feeling as a result of the impact of CJD on your worlds right now, it's entirely consistent with a grief reaction, and one which we would expect given the impact of the symptoms of CJD along your world. And hopefully the grief and loss programme that I touched on very briefly earlier, that Kirsten and I have been working on, will provide a 6-session sort of programme to help people work through some of these feelings and processes that grief along the journey sort of invoke. And so just one final thing that I wanted to mention before I hand back to Beth, if I can, and I'll be a bit speedy, is just to talk to the next slide about triggers for grief. And I think it can be very easy to think about the big triggers, can't it? We sort of prepare ourselves quite often for perhaps the anniversaries, the birthdays, the Christmases. We prepare ourselves for what we know will be big triggers to our memories and our grief reactions. But quite often it's those things that come in side left and really knock us for six, like a piece of music coming on the radio kind of whilst you're cleaning the bathroom, or a friend or couples who we knew celebrating landmark anniversaries that we will never celebrate for ourselves, family and friends having children, they're the things that come inside left and knock us for six quite often. And I just wanted to use this analogy, this picture analogy of grief, which I think is quite helpful. So I'll just briefly describe it quickly, and I hope that it's a helpful kind of picture for you to take away this morning. And basically it sort of works around the idea of this box, and this box is our life. And the ball of grief is something that, when something happens that causes a loss or a pain and a grief reaction, our life at that time is really quite filled with the pain of that event. That ball of grief is big. And as you can see on the lower three slides, in its initial stages, that ball of grief, when it's new, sits pretty much all the time on the pain button of our life. So whether that's the point of diagnosis, whether that's the point at which somebody may have to go into a care home, whether that's the point at which somebody dies, those are kind of the obvious big points at which we would say, of course, I feel absolutely overwhelmed with this grief. Over time, that grief ball shrinks in size, not necessarily in impact and in truth, but in size within the confines of your life. It becomes a more manageable ball. It floats around your life along with other aspects. It doesn't entirely consume you. But whenever that ball, however reduced it might become in terms of size in your life, whenever that ball is triggered to land on that pain button, the feelings of pain that you have are exactly the same as the feelings of pain that you had when that big ball sat on the pain button the whole time. So you can be driving along completely fine, and the song comes on the radio and the ball hits the pain button, and it takes you right back to those feelings that you had right at the most raw and painful kind of moments of your journey. And I think it can be helpful to kind of just recognize that sometimes that grief ball lands on the pain button completely randomly, sometimes by a trigger that we can identify, but that when it does, it lands on that pain button, it causes those reactions, it will move off, it does move off, but it's to kind of allow ourselves to recognize this is what's happening, this is my grief reaction, and to sit with that grief and that emotion in the knowledge that this is an entirely consistent expectation given our journeys. So just to be aware of trigger points really, and to acknowledge them and respond accordingly. Thank you, Beth.
Okay, thank you, Jill. I'm not muted, am I? No. Okay, so Jill, what makes grief different, do you think, in a rare dementia, or when someone gets diagnosed with dementia at a younger than sort of typical age?
Sorry, we should have ordered this slightly differently because you got my voice all over again. It would have been nice to have Kirsten's Australian lilt back on the audio. I think it's really important, isn't it, not to take away from the significance of a dementia diagnosis at any age. It's never a diagnosis that is taken lightly, and it's always got a major impact on whoever's life it's coming into. But there are obvious bespoke issues, aren't there, in a rare and an unusual dementia, which obviously your question implies, Beth. First and foremost, I think the fact that your life course is interrupted. Usually these rare dementias come at a time when you were not expecting them, and quite often at a relatively young age. And that in itself brings a whole load of additional complications. So the plans that people had did not compensate for a diagnosis of CJD unexpectedly. Often, if people are in midlife, they are still very tied into financial responsibilities, be that a mortgage repayment that requires one, if not two, full-time salaries. They will have most of us will have other and ongoing financial sort of demands as well as our mortgage. It's an expensive time of life to receive a life-changing diagnosis. Other impacts are on our sort of family dynamics. So again, slightly different if we're receiving that diagnosis much later in life. Not only does it impact perhaps the relationship between the person who's diagnosed with CJD and their immediate sort of close family and friends, but the ripple effect filters through to perhaps, you know, a wider sort of circle of relationships. And quite often people say, you know, even sort of where there's a partner, you know, it's not just my relationship with my partner that's changed, but it's the fact that I can't be the friend I want to be to my friends. I can't be the mother I want to be to my children, or the grandmother I want to be to my grandchildren. And that's just an example, but obviously a massive sort of ripple effect of the impact on relationships, which we need to think about as an added issue with rare dementias. A much wider range of relationships are impacted. And I think the other thing to kind of pull out, and Kirsten touched on it earlier, is this notion, you know, that when there's a rare diagnosis, the avenues for support aren't always necessarily there. I know you've got a wonderful network of support in this network that you're all part of here. But in terms of families and friends being aware of what CJD actually means, quite often you're having to educate the people around you about the disease that's impacting your world so significantly. And that's a really hard additional sort of challenge to take on when you're managing a rare dementia for yourself. And certainly in my experience of some of the rare dementias, there can be a long period of misdiagnosis. Now, I know with CJD, that perhaps isn't quite as long as for some of the less rapid forms of dementia, but the impact of being misdiagnosed and the kind of mislabeling of your symptoms for a short or a long period of time is a real added sort of impact, I think, in these rare dementia diagnoses, and has a real impact on how you sort of respond and journey through your diagnosis. So those are some of, but not all, of course, the additional issues in a rare dementia. And the next slide just kind of brings those to life a little bit in terms of some of the quotes, a few quotes from people in the support groups that I've kind of worked in recently, where we've looked at sort of the impact of grief and loss as a result of a dementia diagnosis. And for me, the one that stood out the most in terms of a CJD diagnosis would be the one on the top left. So this gentleman who said, "You experience different losses along the journey, all very quickly and one after another. And it's almost as if you just about get yourself on an even keel with the situation, and bang, it changes. It's no longer the situation that you're managing. So you're constantly having the rug pulled from under your feet in terms of how you manage the circumstances that you're facing." I don't know if people would like to comment on any of those quotes and whether any of them speak particularly relevantly, poignantly to you, or whether there's any that you would challenge or disagree with. But over to you for a few comments, if that's okay, Beth.
Mm-hmm, of course. Sorry that you can see my cursor on the screen. I'm just clicking through to see if anybody's got their hand up. Someone said in the chat, sometimes it's hard to notice the losses when they're happening so quickly. I think with sporadic CJD, obviously often it's kind of, you know, a matter of weeks, the progression of the illness. So yeah.
I think that's so true. Thank you for that comment. Actually, that is so true, and I think that is one of the difficulties, isn't it? When you're there the whole time and the changes happen in the way they do, we don't often realise just how much we're carrying you can't step outside and see it objectively because we're so involved in it ourselves, and it's only somebody else looking in perhaps who can say, my word, that's really significant. Yeah.
And I've had a lot of carers sort of saying, sorry, yeah, a lot of carers say to me that, you know, they're just so overwhelmed with the day-to-day tasks and things that need to be done, and the speed of things happening, that they just don't have time to think, or just to sort of process emotions, or to even stop and go, oh, what about me, and what's happening in my mind, and what are my feelings and thoughts through all this is sometimes just put on hold, I think, quite often in the midst of the disease progression, and particularly if something's progressing very rapidly.
Yeah, and a couple more comments in the chat. So somebody saying not knowing or realising how close the end is. And someone else saying because you know that it's fatal, you can start preparing for the death beforehand. This person said that they're a cope by doing person, so they did, but there was also some judgment from people because the person says they talked about the death and grief before it happened.
I think talking about death and dying and grief is such a taboo topic, really, isn't it? That no one really feels comfortable talking about it, and I think it becomes a massive barrier. And I think not talking about it doesn't make it any easier for anyone, or help them deal with it. And I know when we've interviewed people in our research that. So many people, I mean, one of the things we ask at the end is, you know, has this been distressing taking part in this interview, and has it been helpful? And overwhelmingly people say it's been helpful because they just never get a chance to talk about these topics, because they don't really want to burden people with talking about things like death and dying and things that people don't generally, you know, want to talk about something more cheerful than that. So people don't want to talk to others, and then and they just don't get the opportunity to talk about grief and loss. I think is it's hard for people to talk about.
Yeah, and another comment that we've had, sort of looking at this slide, so the term kind of misdiagnosis, which kind of saying perhaps it's more around changing diagnoses in line with developments. You know, the kind of misdiagnosis as a term, you know, or as a concept might have a, you know, cause anger, those kinds of emotions, but certainly within CJD often it's kind of as the pieces of the puzzle are being put together for diagnosis, then things change.
Yeah.
Having to constantly adapt, and what you're trying to face, what you're dealing with.
Yeah. And I think, as Kirsten said, quite often you don't have time to process these emotions whilst you're in the process of living with and caring for somebody with CJD. And that obviously impacts the way in which grief affects us after the death of somebody, because there's a lot of processing of emotions that have been sort of running sort of tended, often for a long time before the person has actually died. And just to go back to that slide, Beth, which you did a moment ago, I didn't talk specifically to anger and resentment as this added issue, but I think it ties in with the guilt that Kirsten pulled out in this sort of conversation that we're having now. And I think there isn't a lot of places for people to talk about the anger and resentment that they quite rightly have about a diagnosis that has changed their lives and their worlds so radically. And again, people are right to be angry and resentful of a diagnosis of any dementia at any age. But when that diagnosis comes, as CJD does, and quite often to people who are, you know, in midlife, or sort of certainly a diagnosis that they weren't expecting, that anger and resentment is entirely rational, but what we do with that is really important. And I think your conversations have actually led perfectly into the next slide, which is just to kind of really recognize that all these additional issues that are more common and typical in a rare dementia, and specifically CJD in our case, are triggers for what we call psychological stress. So again, stress is something, isn't it, that we all experience and we all talk about and we all understand, and we can be under stress for all sorts of reasons if we're busy at work or if we've got deadlines to meet. But this is the kind of psychological stress that I would suggest possibly as carers of somebody with a rare dementia, or CJD in particular, are common to your experience. So if the triggers for psychological stress are, as these on the slide say, loss of control, loss of predictability, as one of your members implied in terms of not being able to predict how the symptoms will progress, it's just one example. Loss of outlets for frustration. Where do you go to let off steam when 24/7 you're required to be at home, or the carer? And the challenge of not knowing what the future holds whilst you're exhausted with today. All of these triggers contribute to psychological stress. And so I would just suggest that it's helpful to recognise the impact of stress. Stress causes all of us to behave and feel and think in particular ways. But actually, if you can recognise that the reason I'm feeling in this way is because I'm under stress, perhaps it gives us permission to understand and accept why we're feeling the way we are. And just to finish, before handing back to Beth again, this slide conveys really the message I really want to convey at this point, and that is this message to be kind to yourselves. So whatever your current situation is in relation to CJD and its impact on your life, can we try and find ways to be kind to ourselves? You didn't choose this situation. You didn't want this situation. And no one is perfect. No one can deal with challenging and difficult situations perfectly. It's an imperfect situation, and you have dealt with it and are dealing with it to the very best of your ability in the circumstances that you have. And so I think I would just want to say, be kind to yourselves and have compassion on yourselves in the circumstances that you find yourselves in as a result of this journey you're on. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, Jill. So we come on to the third theme now, which leads very nicely from there, I think. So Kirsten, what are some of the strategies that people may find helpful to deal with these kind of intense moments of emotion and grief? And also, which services are there that are kind of available to support people who are experiencing grief?
Yeah, well, I've sort of drawn this slide from experiences from the carers that I talked to in my fellowship study, and sort of grouped them into sort of three broad themes that sort of kept coming out from the carers we talked to. So, and sort of really just coming back to what Jill was just saying about sort of being kind to yourself, is that first sort of main theme we found was sort of recognising your own needs and your own identity. And for some people that, you know, how that was played out by different people varied. Some people found it fulfilling to provide care, to be able to give back to their loved one, to feel that they were providing, you know, giving back their love, and that was a way of dealing with their grief, and that they were creating something positive through this sad situation. But for others, they didn't find, you know, the sort of carer role, if you want to call it that, at all fulfilling, and just found it terribly stressful and distressing, and didn't embrace it in that way. And those people tended to, you know, to sort of, in a different sort of sense, you know, it was about putting their own needs first and thinking about how they're going to look after themselves, how they're going to factor in time to have enjoyable activities, to have time out, to take a break, and to just sort of zone out from the situation they were in. And other people talked about, in that, recognising their own needs and their own identity around reciprocating care. So, I mean, obviously they were participating in research, so they're the sort of people that would volunteer to take part in research, but they often talked about how that was important for them to sort of give their views to sort of try and help other carers in the future, and so the services could be more understanding and be more responsive to their needs, so that it wasn't, so it could be better for carers in the future. The sort of second group of strategies that we identified were much more about, just psychological strategies. So this is very internal processes about how you think about things and how you process what you're going through. And the most common ones, and I guess we don't know sort of how effective these things are. This is just sort of what people were most often using, is they were just talking about just thinking about things in a more positive manner, being more practical, using humour, looking at the funny side of things, and just accepting the situation, not, just accepting that you can't change it, and to try and see the most positive aspects that you can out of it. We also had a lot of people talking about separation, and that was in sort of two different ways. So some people talked about separating from the person with dementia altogether. So I think some particularly for a sort of a longer case, a longer prognosis and a longer duration of dementia, particularly in those advanced stages where perhaps their spouse had gone into a care home and they no longer recognise them, and they'd had gone through a lot of their grieving process, but they actually felt that that person was just no longer their spouse, that person wasn't the same person anymore, and they actually sort of, the way that they dealt with that was to say, this just isn't my spouse. I mourn and have lost my spouse, and this person isn't my spouse. And other people had a separation in a different way, where they'd separated the person from the dementia and had to remind themselves that sort of behaviours or things that the person with dementia is doing or saying, they had to remind them that was because of the disease process, and not to sort of, not to attribute that or connect that to the person themselves, the person that they had a relationship with, but to try and just remind themselves that the dementia caused a lot of these sort of symptoms and things that they found frustrating or upsetting. And the final group of strategies that carers talked about was seeking support, and we've already touched on that. So that either is through family, friends and peers, through professional support, but also people talked about the importance of getting practical support for day-to-day tasks, so that they could help to deal with, so they had that time where they could sit back and sort of actually process their emotions. So that sort of just the day-to-day busyness of life meant that, it was difficult to take time out and really sort of process sort of the losses that they were going through. So getting assistance with those day-to-day tasks was really helpful for some people. And just on the next slide, we also, I guess this is quite a lot to take in on this slide. I guess the first thing to say is that of the 150 people talked to, 117 of those identified, when we asked them, do you think you're grieving at the moment? Most of them said that they were, and 33 of the 150 didn't feel that they were grieving at that point in time. Some of the ones that said they weren't grieving now said they had already gone through their grief and sort of weren't grieving anymore. But we also asked them what sorts of professional supports or services they had used to try and process and deal with their grief. And you can see there that in the first two bars, so the blue bars are people who say they're grieving, and the red bars are people who say they're not grieving. You can see that most people had obviously talked to family and friends, and we know that's a fairly common way of processing grief. Carer support groups, we had just under half of the participants that had accessed carer support groups to deal with their grief. And it was a real mixed response as to how helpful people found those. Some people found talking to other carers as the most helpful thing, that not really anyone else could understand what they were going through unless they were also caring for someone with dementia. And so that's the only people they really found helpful talking to. But for other carers, they found that the last thing they wanted was to hear other carers talking about the same sort of struggles they were having, and not in a selfish way, but that they felt, that they were struggling to deal with their own emotions and what they were dealing with day to day, and they just felt like they didn't have enough sort of emotional support to be able to actually give that and to support other people as well. So they found it quite draining, actually being in part of support groups. So I think we need to be mindful that this is very helpful for some people, but not everyone. We had around a third of participants access NHS or private professional counselling, quite a few, or just under half, going to GPs to access support or to get referrals for other support. Information was quite important, and we had quite a lot in the other sort of category, and mainly this was Admiral nurses who are dementia specialist nurses who can provide support for family carers. There's not really enough of them across the country to support the number of people living with dementia, so not everyone has access to those, but they certainly can be very helpful if they're available locally. And many people talked about online forums and carer education sessions as well. And so you can see only a very small number had not sort of sought any type of support for their grief. And I guess just going back to those grief guidelines and the bereavement supports that I mentioned early on, that pyramid 3-tier structure that's been developed out of cancer services suggests that around about 10% of people would require professional support, but this research here is suggesting that actually most family carers, people with dementia, are accessing sort of professional supports, and I think overall 55% had sought either GP or counselling support rather than sort of that 10% figure. So, and I think I'll hand over to Jill. Sorry.
Thank you. And again, just to try and sort of combine Kirsten's research and the data and statistics, which is so helpful to kind of base our understandings on, to look at some of the strategies for living with grief. I think I put managing on the slide, but I'm very aware that managing sometimes conveys the wrong impression. Actually, for living with grief is more the sentiment I want to sort of go with. And I think the first thing to really say is that in no way at all are we looking to cure or treat grief. It's an important emotion, and it's a functional emotion. And there's a reason that we feel grief as a response to significant losses and sadnesses. And what we want to do is to try and live as well as we can with grief, given that we have no escape from it. So we're not in any way suggesting that it's something to be cured or treated. But in terms of some of the strategies that might help us to live with grief a little bit more comfortably, one or two to sort of talk to here off the slide. And the first kind of comes back to the point one of our members made earlier about having somewhere to voice what you're feeling. So actually acknowledging the losses that you are experiencing and acknowledging the way they make you feel, the anxieties and the fears that they may hold as a consequence, is a massive step in its own right to sort of allowing those feelings to be sat with. So for some people that can be speaking in a group like this, or it can be joining a support group, but for others actually writing a letter, writing a note, writing a journal, seeing the written words on a paper can be very empowering. And depending on your sort of artistic ability and preference, you know, whether you choose to draw out your feelings and emotions, or paint your feelings and emotions, or play out in music your feelings and emotions, to actually find a way to express, having acknowledged them, express them, get them out there. And to really allow ourselves to sit with our emotions. If we feel sad, feel sad. If we want to cry, cry. We don't live in a very sort of grief-friendly society, do we? I think we often apologise for crying. And to go back earlier to that, you know, the contribution we had where we apologise for sounding dramatic, we apologise for crying. Society doesn't feel at ease with expressions of grief, and that's not your fault, that's not our fault. In some cultures, you know, wailing and expressive crying is kind of recognized and embraced and encouraged. Western culture doesn't particularly allow us an expression of grief in a terribly sort of easy and accessible way. But sitting with your emotions, whatever they are, allowing them is so, so important and so, so acceptable. And I think it sounds silly sometimes and it sounds trite, but when so much around us feels out of control, just taking control over some of the little things in life can be incredibly helpful in terms of gaining and regaining our perspectives in terms of where we are with our own grief. So that can be something as kind of simple as baking a cake, or arranging flowers in a vase, or taking 5 minutes in the garden to do something that you can take control over in the midst of what can feel otherwise a very overwhelmingly out of control situation. I think it's probably wise to say, you know, that we try and stay connected in some way, shape or form with our networks. So it may well be that that has to be on the periphery for some time, depending on the sort of the focus and the priority that our caring role might demand of us. But actually, the rest of the world is continuing whilst we are in this kind of almost semi sort of separated or semi-frozen role, and to try and stay connected in some way, shape or form, even on the periphery, to the world that's continuing and the networks that are continuing around us. And I think to just be mindful of unhelpful thinking patterns. We all slip into them, but particularly when we're vulnerable, as we are when we're grieving, and as again one of your contributors helpfully mentioned earlier this morning, that sense of being vulnerable. When we're vulnerable, we slip very quickly into unhelpful thinking patterns. So for example, you know, I should have, I could have, I wish I'd done this better. You know, we slip into that so quickly, and actually into regret very quickly as well. And I think it's really important to remember that we do the best we can at the time with the resources we have in the circumstances we're faced with. And for sure, that might look different a minute later, an hour later, a year later. But at the time, it was the best you could do with the resources you had available to them. And unhelpful thinking patterns that sort of suggest otherwise are very sort of disempowering and quite sort of crippling at times. Obviously reaching out for support, like Kirsten's mentioned previously, in whatever form that feels most comfortable for you. Reaching out for support can be difficult, and for all sorts of reasons. But in terms of identifying the kind of help that would most be useful for you and the people who would most be able to provide that sort of help. And I think over the years that I've worked alongside people, one of the lessons they've taught me is that it helps often, if you are asking for help, to be able to offer people a range of things that would be helpful. So quite often people want to help but don't know how to help. And if we sort of say, oh, I could really do with a lift to the doctors tomorrow, and they can't provide that, then kind of it's a bit awkward. And they sort of, if 2 or 3 times they offer and can't provide, eventually they take a step back and think, I can't offer again because I can't say no again. But if we can think ahead and perhaps provide a suite of things that would be useful for us and present them to people who we know would like to help, it perhaps just empowers them to take a wider view of what they could do to help us in a meaningful way. And I think that we're okay-ish for time. Rather than talking about one step at a time, I'm just going to read very quickly a poem that says exactly what the one step at a time message is, and then we'll move on to the next theme. So just very quickly, I'll read this short poem, and it's called Grieving. My grandmother once gave me a tip. In difficult times, you move forward in small steps. Do what you have to do, but little by little. Don't think about the future or what may happen tomorrow. wash the dishes, remove the dust, write a letter, make a soup, and you see, you are advancing step by step. Take a step and stop. Rest a little. Praise yourself. Take another step, then another. You won't notice, but your steps will grow more and more. And the time will come when you can think about the future without crying. I think she expresses far more eloquently than I could that message of just one step at a time. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you.
Before we go to the next one, sorry, Beth. I just thought we haven't sort of mentioned, you know, that this particular period in history as well, and in time, and the COVID pandemic is also another. I think Jill mentioned our sort of assumptive world, and this idea that we kind of expect our world to look a certain way and to behave a certain way, and for certain people to be there. And I think, in a way, we're all going through a bit of a grief on top of grief that you're already going through with COVID, and what we expect of life has totally changed. And I think that's also has a massive impact on people's access to supports and who's available, and being able to see people and get that support is also really impacted. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, that this is also an added loss that a lot of us are going through at the moment.
I think that's really important. Thank you, Kirsten. And I think the other thing that came to me during the course of the morning is to say, obviously, given the nature of this discussion, we have focused on the losses and the grief that comes alongside the impact of a CJD diagnosis. And to recognise that, of course, there are moments within that diagnosis that open up avenues for joy and for fulfillment. So we wouldn't want to sort of detract from the whole experience that people will have had as sort of carers, friends and family. But obviously our focus today has been on the grief and the loss.
Thank you. Okay, so now we'll come on to the last theme before we stop the recording for a few minutes of discussion. So Kirsten, is there any research on grief among family carers, specifically of CJD?
Yes, well, we are just about to do some. We're currently, Liz Sampson at the Marie Curie Palliative Care Research Department, in a study I'm involved with as well. We're doing a collaborative study called Empowering Better End-of-Life Care in Dementia, and this is a study with King's College London, and we're also working with the Prion unit. So as part of that study, we're recruiting 50 people and their family carers with sporadic CJD, and we will be doing assessments as part of the National Prion Monitoring Study, but we'll be doing some extra assessments around palliative care and end-of-life care, and following participants for up to 12 months. So if the person with dementia dies during that period, we'll also be doing a post grief 6 months after death, if the carer is willing to do that, and a measure of prolonged grief disorder. So I think it's the only study that I know of that's looking at sort of grief in carers, people with CJD. And the other work that is going on, which Jill briefly mentioned, is the program we're developing with the Rare Dementia Service, which is going to be an online interactive session of 8 sessions. So talking about some of the things we've touched on today, but as a much more of an interactive sort of session with carers, which is supposed to be sort of partly educational, but also quite discussing and working through their own experiences of grief. And the other thing that I think is probably just worth mentioning that might be of interest to people is that there's I think it's the University of Liverpool, I think, is organising the Good Grief Festival. And if you just Google the Good Grief Festival, it's on at the end of October. It's free to access, and there's going to be a whole lot of different, it's got a fantastic program. There's all different topics. I'm on a panel with one on dementia care, but there's a whole lot of different topics on grief that look really interesting. So you can access those panel sessions online at the end of October. So just worth keeping an eye out for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kirsten. It's good to know that there is research happening with family carers of CJD. I guess I would assume most of the people here today are kind of former carers, but I think even as a former carer, it's still nice to know that, you know, something's happening and it's being included as part of the wider study. So thank you. So what I'll do now is turn off the recording so that we can have some final questions and comments. I realise people might not have wanted to comment so far because of the recording, so this is the time where we can do that. Yep, so we started the recording again. So so the details of the CJD support network are there if people need to access support from us. So the helpline is for questions or just someone to listen. And yeah, the Facebook group, as Kate was saying just now, and more generally, Cruise Bereavement Care, which I think Kirsten mentioned quite in the beginning of the session. There's lots of supportive information on their website, and again, they have a helpline and also an online chat option, which you can access through their website. Also, obviously, we would kind of recommend that people speak to their GP to find out about what's available locally. I know there'll be different types of services available locally. People can also email the CJD Support Network email address, which is support@CJD. Kate, is it support@cjd.net? Yeah.
Support@cjdsupport.net.
Support@cjdsupport.net. I'll put that in the chat to everyone, because if you've got any feedback on the session, or again want to kind of have any more information about anything, then you can contact us there. Thank you.
And Marie Curie also offers bereavement support services as well, and they're I don't know if people have picked up on that. They've dropped their cancer care because they're recognising that palliative care is beyond cancer care as well.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll go back to the activity.
Okay. And this absolutely is to Andrew's point, precisely, that when we were preparing in advance for this morning, we were very aware that these were difficult conversations, and to leave kind of people remotely to close down laptops feels so unnatural and out of kilter. If we were together, we'd be pouring the coffee and sort of sharing the cake, wouldn't we? So I wish I could be doing that. I really wish I could be doing that. But here we go with something that we hope leaves us with a slightly different mindset as we bring our meeting to a close and head on to face all that the rest of the day holds. So I'm sorry that none of us really felt that we had the perfect voice for this kind of visualization, but we'll do our best with a northern accent and see what I can do. So I just wanted, if you would, to ask you to close your eyes and take a few deep breaths, and just try and let your shoulders drop and let the conversations that we've had fall away from your mind. Let that go for the moment, and place in your mind an image of a white gate. Imagine that you stand for a few moments looking at the gate. Now open the gate and walk through it. And you see in front of you a lawn of the most perfect green and a beautiful garden. Close the gate and walk slowly across the soft and restful turf beneath your feet. As you walk, the most perfect green colour flows into your body, soothing your mind and bringing peace. Continue to walk slowly, enjoying the soothing, restful green. As you walk, you see in front of you a quiet pool that reflects the blue of the sky. Walk slowly to the edge of the pool and see steps of the purest white going down into the water. You notice that the blue colour is the most perfect blue you've ever seen. Slowly and peacefully walk down the steps into the water that you discover to be unlike ordinary water, as you do not appear to get wet. Go deeper into the water and feel the most beautiful penetrating light flowing into your body. Immerse yourself, completely letting the vibrant blue light flow through your whole being. Feel its healing qualities searching out and penetrating every discomfort and bringing about a state of well-being. Now visualize strong hands. Maybe they're the hands of an angel that lift you from the pool of light and lay you gently onto the green grass. Rest for a few moments, enjoying the scents of the garden. And when you feel ready, stand up and walk back slowly the way you came, enjoying the peace that every step gives you. Notice the white gate, beautifully clear in the sunlight. Open the gate and walk through. Stand for a few moments again, looking at the gate and recognizing that it is the first image you placed in the mind, and it's the key to your garden of light. Slowly let this scene fade from your mind. Become aware of your breathing and of your resting body. Take a deep breath now. Wiggle your fingers and toes. And when you're ready, open your eyes and rejoin our Zoom call. And know that if we could, we would be wrapping you in a virtual hug for sure. And if we were with you for sure, we'd be hugging you properly in different times. So hold on to that garden and take it with you from this meeting. It's a special place and it's a place that's yours. And the hug that goes with it is very, very real. And thank you so, so much for your time this morning. Thank you.